Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mark's Movies. And today we're going to discuss horror movies of the 40s and 50s. Now, when I first started doing this, I decided to ignore like the 1900s and 19 teens for horror because let's be honest, if you actually go back and look, there's not really anything worth talking about. And it was the same type of horror as the 20s and 30s. The 20s and 30s just did it better. The 40s mostly continues on with what the 20s and 30s did. You have a bunch of monster movies. The Wolfman, actually, that I mentioned in my last video, didn't come out until 1941. But I was mostly trying to mention the vast majority of the monster, like the classic monster movies that I was going to mention for all of horror, for all of my conversations, because in the 40s, you just get a lot of sequels. You got a lot of sequels to horror movies, like Dracula meets the Mummy, or they both meet Abbott and Costello, or the Three Stooges, or you have The Invisible Woman, you have The Invisible Man Returns, you have all these other things, including remakes with bigger named actors. Like, for instance, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the one I told you about with Frederick March from the 30s, is amazing, is one of the best. In the 40s, Spencer Tracy takes on the role with Lana Turner and I believe Ingrid Bergman in it. And it's not as good. Those three actors and actresses are phenomenal. It's just not as good of a production. It's not as good of a movie. But they just started to be able to realize that they could capitalize using bigger name stars as opposed to just Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff and so on and so forth, Claude Rains. And they could take these bigger stars and make these movies again. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, for instance, was also remade at the time with Humphrey Bogart in it. So I'm just saying, there are other versions you might see. Don't be tempted. They're not as good, even if they have bigger names in it. In the 40s, what we see besides the horror genre, with continuing on with the monster movies, you start to get a rise of another genre. It's very similar to horror. They walk a fine line. Horror usually there's some supernatural entity or element to it. If you think about it, go back to most of the horror you know of from your own time, from our own time. A lot of it has to do with supernatural things. Talk about the movie Get Out, and that's hypnotism and all. There's that little sense of something off. You go to It Follows, and it's this unknown entity that's passed through sex, so on and so forth. A lot of the horror that we get nowadays and that we've been getting through recently, most of the time we've made movies, has been supernatural in nature. But in the 40s, you see a rise of the suspense thriller and the psychological thrillers, or as I'm just going to label them, thrillers. And these movies were basically the same beats as a horror movie, but instead of Bela Lugosi, walking towards you with his cape and the eyes, or the mummy, coming at you and is wrapped up and all, you get an actual killer. You get a person, and it explores more of the dark side of humanity by a reflection of what we actually do to each other. In the 40s, we get some great examples of this. Now, I've mentioned before my love of two filmmakers that were making movies in the Ford and starting at this time period. John Ford is not really famous for any horror movies, but Alfred Hitchcock is. So I'm going to do my best to limit. Being a huge fan of Hitchcock, I'm going to do my best to limit. I'm going to limit it to three on this list from the 40s and 50s. I will give a shout out to a couple others, but three mainly on the list. Two from the 40s, one from the 50s. The 40s, like I said, has this start of the thriller. So I'm going to start with the three thrillers from the 40s. The first one I'm going to mention is a movie called Gaslight that stars Ingrid Bergman, and it came out in the 40s, in 44. And it's also the very first movie for the late, great Angela Lansbury, who just passed recently. And she was just as brilliant as she always is. She's actually a really good, a really important performance in that role, in that film. But she and that movie are synonymous. Well, that movie is synonymous with the whole not being able to trust your instincts, or not being able to trust, not being able to know who you can trust. It's a theme that's common in thrillers, that's common in horror movies when they start taking on more of the characteristics of thrillers. When you start getting into the slasher films of the 70s and 80s, you start to see more of this. You don't know who to trust because you don't know who the killer is. And that's something that starts out in these thrillers from the day. And the two Alfred Hitchcock movies are no exceptions. 1940s Rebecca, based on the Daphne du Maurier novel, or du Maurier, I should say, and which is all about the haunting of a memory. The memory of Rebecca is haunting this house, and it just seeps into every pore. And then you have Shadow of a Doubt, the movie that Hitchcock himself considers the best movie he ever made. It's his favorite film he ever made. And it's just a tale about a family and two people named Charlie, and one of them might be a serial killer. And the other, his niece, is on to him. I'm pretty sure I said about that much in the last video, but it's very intense. It's very dark at times. It's very well done. I very much enjoy it. Another movie in this time period that sort of starts to bridge the gap between the horror genre and the thriller genre is The Picture of Dorian Gray, the classic work by Oscar Wilde. It's one of his most nihilistic. It's definitely one of those stories that's about the extravagance of life and how it can corrupt, how money and power can corrupt, especially if all that corruption is held into one painting. Yeah, and the one from the early 40s is my favorite version of The Picture of Dorian Gray. Another movie that is a little further along the path to straight horror from the same time period in the 40s, but also still is mostly a thriller because it's mostly about people. Again, it's a haunting. The House of the Seven Gables, which stars Vincent Price, and it came out in the mid 40s. Vincent Price is someone who will become very popular, of course. He's a character actor who starts to be known for his macabre work, and he just continues and embraces it and becomes like the king of horror for the next 2 decades. And we'll be mentioning him a couple more times for the 50s. But before we discuss the movies of the 50s, we need to go why the movies of the 50s occurred, because there's a shift. And you have to remember the three big things that occur in the late 40s and 50s to cause this. The first of which is on August 6th and August 9th of 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are bombed. The atomic bombs are dropped on them by America, by us. And the devastation that it rains, we discover is even more than what we bargained for after the fallout. And we started to notice all of the damage and destruction that the radiation continue to do to the local wildlife, the animals and the plants and things. This was also noticed after Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. And also our testing sites in Paradise and in the west of the United States. All of these areas, we started seeing the growths of extra limbs, extra heads, larger than normal. These species of rodents and lizards and things grew. And so that became popular. One of the best examples of it in the 50s especially is one of the kings of the kaiju, Godzilla. The first Godzilla film came out in early 50s, 51, I believe. After Godzilla and after that, you also had our fight to get to outer space. The space race would come in the 60s, but before the space race, we had to start realizing we could actually break the sound barrier. We could actually start traveling fast enough to get there, traveling fast enough to get into outer space or to get to outer space. So we started having these daring test pilots who were cranking the speed to 11 and just going for it, risking their lives, risking very expensive technology just to try to push it harder, faster, higher, just to get to the point where we could touch outer space. And then the dream of going to space became more of a reality. But that dream also had a flip side, the nightmare of what if we're not the only ones out there? What if we're not the only ones who are looking? That's a dream that's old. I mean, I'm going to mention two sci-fi films now because they walk the line between sci-fi and horror, but both of them are about that exact concept of what if there's others. And they're both based on novels, one of them by H.G. Wells from back in the day, and that's War of the Worlds, of course. But I also have to mention The Day the Earth Stood Still. Those are honorable mentions because, like I said, they're thrilling, they're sci-fi, they're a little more niche than the classic horror. So if you like sci-fi and you like sci-fi thrillers, those are definitely good watches. Both were remade in the 2000s. Don't bother. Don't. I love Steven Spielberg, but his movie was fine. The original one's better. Then the last thing was after World War II, you started getting the largest and most dangerous game of Risk ever played between the USSR and America during the Cold War. And during this time period, we in America didn't know who we could trust. We didn't know if we could trust our neighbors because they might have sympathies towards the communists, or they might be communists themselves. They could be red or they could be pink, as they were known. Not the pure white of us Americans. So Joseph McCarthy started scaring the hell out of all of us by calling out our neighbors and calling out people we knew. People in Hollywood started being called out for being communists or having visited a rally one time that was communist leaning, or they went to a book club this one time and it had communist connections or whatever. So all of those things started to happen, and that gave rise to that, and the alien concept gave rise to three of the best horror movies from the 50s. And those are The Blob, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and The Thing from Another World. All three are basically about so The Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Thing from Another World are both about who can you trust. Is your neighbor still your neighbor, or is he really a pod person in disguise? That's The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The Thing from Another World is about this alien can shapeshift. So is that really your friend, or is your friend somebody else now? That's the similar undertones of, is that person your friend, or are they really a communist? You've known them for, a few years now. Y'all are buddies, but that doesn't mean that they're not a communist in disguise who've just been here for a long time and planted in our society to just wait until their time to rise up and get us. These are the fears of the Joseph McCarthy era and Pinkos. The Blob is just about the growing force of communism and the spread of it. And as it just took over more and more, it got bigger and more powerful and harder to stop. All three of them are very well worth a watch. And I will be telling you now, I will probably be mentioning all three of these movies again because they were remade superior to these originals. All three were remade better. Except for maybe The Blob. The Blob might have stayed about the same. I will give a shout out to Steve McQueen, who one of his very first performances was in the original The Blob from the early 50s. Last but not least, in this time period in the 50s, we also have a couple of other great horror movies with the great Vincent Price. And that one Alfred Hitchcock movie I told you I was going to bring up is, so let's do Vincent Price real quick. So Vincent Price, as I said, made a lot of great films in the 50s and 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s before he passed away. And he was always known for being darker and more mysterious and, kind of the villain. And one of the best examples of this, or two of the best, I'll give both of them, were House on Haunted Hill and House of Wax. They both came out in the mid to late 50s, and they're both far superior to the remakes that came out much later, especially House of Wax. Oh my God. Don't. House of Wax is crap. The remake from the 2000s is crap. It's garbage. The one from the 50s is very good. Very good. The acting is superb and the storytelling is very, I bring up pacing a lot, as very well paced. I love the way House of Wax looks and is done. For the Alfred Hitchcock film from the 50s, there are several greats to choose from. Remember, this is the time period of North by Northwest, Vertigo, Strangers on a Train, The Man Who Knew Too Much, and being an Alfred Hitchcock fan, I highly recommend you watch all of those. But at the end of the day, if you're going to talk about the best dark thriller of this time period, you got to go Rear Window, 1954. Grace Kelly, Jimmy Stewart. That's the one you want. That's the one you definitely want. So those are the movies. Those are my movies for the 40s and 50s. Next, we will be going into the 60s and 70s. I may have to start separating it out into one decade at a time. Though I think I do like the challenge of trying to limit the horror movies that I talk about. Limit the movies I talk about to 5 per decade from now on. Because like I said, that first set was mostly just monster movies. So I just gave you a bunch of monster movies and I said, here are my 10 favorites. And this time I decided to do 5 in the 40s and 5 in the 50s, and I'll probably continue that on with 60s, 70s, 80s, so on, till today. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe below. Please comment. I want to hear from you about your favorite horror movies of the 40s and 50s, and if you haven't seen them, watch the ones I mentioned and then tell me what you think. Remember, horror from today cannot be compared to horror from yesterday, from the 40s, 30s, 20s, 50s. They're not the same. Even in the 60s, they're not the same. You start getting closer when you start getting into the 70s because of things that are allowed to be shown. Remember, blood was barely allowed in Psycho, and that was in the 60s. So there's a lot of things. And that was only because it was black and white, to be perfectly honest. So there's a lot of things that we take for granted now that we can see constantly in horror movies that were not allowed, and they had to find different ways to get around it while also trying to be terrifying. So, and they also played on the fears of the day. So remember that when you're watching them. They're not nearly as scary. Even people who don't really like horror movies, most of these movies you should be able to watch just fine, to be perfectly honest. All right, well, that's my list. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, please like and subscribe and comment below. Thank you.